So Rabbi Mordechai Becher tells a story, a personal story, which you sometimes wonder if they actually happened there because he's just funny. And he tells about the time he was staying for Shabbos in a hotel, and they put him up on the 11th floor. So he tried to avoid having to go downstairs as much as he can, but I guess he was there to speak somewhere and he had to come down, and then he had to make his way back up the stairs to the 11th story of the hotel. And he's staggering his way up the stairs, and around the 10th floor, he's in the stairwell. He encounters a staff person of the hotel in the stairwell, and the staff member sees him and he says, what are you doing? Why didn't you just take the elevator? So he, wheezing and huffing and puffing and all red and sweaty and everything, he says, well, today is the Jewish Sabbath. It's my day of rest. So that story does beg the question of why can't he just take the elevator? You know, what if in fact the Shabbos is a day of rest? So why don't we? Why are we so stringent about things? Why are there so many prohibitions? What is really the goal here of the rest that we have on Shabbos? Now, we have spoken, of course, we've given some ideas already that relate to this, but we've also spoken about the idea of there being Zachor and Shamor. Zachor, remember the Shabbos, being the positive commandments, and the Shamor, guard the Shabbos, referring perhaps to the prohibitions, according to many. So all the prohibited acts, the melachos, as we call them, and as we'll discuss more. So I saw a cute mashal, a cute analogy in the name of the Vilna Gaon, although it doesn't seem like his style, so I'm not sure. But that to understand this concept a little bit, or really to introduce the concept, he says that there was once a child who they wanted to test him with a riddle. And the riddle was, this is a different child and a different riddle than last night, Robert. The riddle was, well, they said that before they told him the riddle, he said, what's my prize if I answer the riddle? So they said, we'll give you 2 cookies if you answer the riddle. So he's like, okay. So what was the riddle? So they said, how is it possible for 2 people to each be the uncle of the other one at the same time? So 2 men, and they're each other's uncles. So the boy thought for a moment, and you could think about it and see if you could figure out the answer. The boy thought for a moment, and he said, well, if you have, usually when we say you have Ruvain being one person, and Shimon, and so if Ruvain and Shimon are brothers, so then Shimon's son and Ruvain would be Shimon's son's uncle. So there's one. So they said, very good. Okay, now tell us the other way though. How could Shimon now be Ruvain's uncle? How could the son be the uncle of the uncle? So he said, I'm not sure, but I got half the answer. So can I have one of the 2 cookies? So said the Vilna Gaon that you can't have one of the 2 cookies. You can't have one without the other. You need both. And similarly, when the Torah says Zachor and Shamor, remember the Shabbos and guard it. So you need both, and that's why they were b'dibur echad. That's why they were said at the same moment simultaneously, as we discussed in a previous class, because you can't have one without the other. Shabbos is not only about remembering the Shabbos about Zachor. It's not only about Shamor, guarding the Shabbos, the prohibitions of Shabbos. but they go together, and one without the other is not a complete answer. It's not a complete Shabbos. So and you don't get either of the cookies if you don't have both. So let's talk a bit about the Shamor side of things, the guard the Shabbos, the prohibitions, the idea of refraining from Melacha. And Melacha is a word that really needs to be explained what that is. So let's look for a moment, if you have the source sheet, otherwise just listen on, to the Ten Commandments. The first place where we really have an explicit command about Shabbos, actually not really the first place, but the first place where we have an explicit command about Melacha, about refraining from Melacha. And there it says, remember the Shabbos to sanctify it. For 6 days you shall do work. And do all of your Melacha. Do all of your Melacha. Melacha, again, needs to be explained what it is. Labor, work, maybe neither of those. Constructive activity is probably going to be a better definition. But the seventh day, the Yom HaShavi Shabbos /Hashem Elokecha. The seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. Lo sa'aseh kol melacha. You shall not perform any melacha. You and your entire family. So here we have the way the prohibition, the negative prohibitions of Shabbos are expressed are that you can do melacha all week long. On Shabbos, you cannot do melacha. So what is this melacha? What is it? What is it not? So we're going to be mainly focusing on the writings of Rav Hirsch, Rav Shamshi Raphael Hirsch. We touched on it briefly last week, his general concept of Melacha. I want to, really focus in on it, discuss it at greater length. So just to understand the historical context of the setting that Rav Hirsch found himself in. Rav Hirsch lived in Germany, where the Reform movement was expanding rapidly. People were quickly, abandoning many Jewish practices, and Rav Hirsch Rav Hirsch was a very, very novel thinker, amazing writer, and he wrote in German. Everything that we have is translated, but was very careful about keeping the tradition while still finding a way to function in the sort of enlightened German society, which existed in the 1800s when he lived. So Rav Hirsch, though, was faced with the challenge of bringing Jews back to observance of Shabbos and other commandments, and he says, and I put some excerpts onto the source sheet and some left out. So I'll let you know once I'm reading from the source sheet. But Rav Hirsch tells us, Rav Hirsch writes in his commentary on Chumash, and I should just note, Rav Hirsch wrote in many different ways. He wrote a commentary on the Torah, which is what I'm drawing from primarily. He wrote down essays or speeches that he gave, which are collected, the collected writings. So there's writings about Shabbos there. He wrote a book about all the mitzvos and sort of the ideas behind them called Chorev. And there also he'll talk about Shabbos, and you'll see a lot of overlap of the same perspectives. These were his views, and he writes that the idea of Shabbos has become distorted and undermined by the mistranslation of the word melacha as work, as labor. When people say thou shalt not do any work on Shabbos, so people think that simply means, don't go to work, take the day off from work. And then you have fulfilled the commandment of Shabbos. And it's much more than that, though. So now, picking up on the source sheet, he writes, without having the slightest concern whether there was any foundation for it in the Torah, or whether such an interpretation was even permitted by the Torah, Sabbath was proclaimed as a day of bodily rest, so that the mind might be freer to devote itself to God in spiritual matters. So it's interesting, actually. Some writers from his time, and you see this in the writings of the Kasav Sofer, where numerous times he is challenging the idea, the notion that Shabbos is simply a day of rest because everybody needs to rest every 7 days or so. It's too much, to keep working. He has to challenge that idea. Rav Hirsch, at least, is challenging an idea that's a little past that. He's not arguing against people claiming that it's simply a day of rest. No, he's arguing with people who are a little bit more, ahead of that. It's a day of rest to be able to devote oneself to spiritual matters. But that's what it is. Why do we rest on Shabbos? In order to devote ourselves to spiritual matters. This is the idea that people are claiming, and Rav Hirsch is challenging. Shabbos is the purpose of rest on Shabbos is not just to be available to attend synagogue, attend shul, and pursue spiritual matters. He says, prohibited melacha was then accordingly defined as labor, hard physical work. Only hard physical work, they said, is prohibited on Sabbath. But easy, non-strenuous work, or work undertaking for spiritual activities, is allowed. If the purpose is to be able to pursue my spiritual activities, to attend synagogue or whatever it might be, so then it's allowed, because the whole purpose, they said, of resting on Shabbos is A, to rest from physical activity, and B, to be able to pursue spiritual matters. So as long as what I'm doing doesn't get in the way of that, even if I'm cooking on Shabbos, but if it's for a Shabbos meal, so then people would say it's okay because it's for the purpose of a Shabbos meal. But this is a mistake. He says, and so the adjustment of the law to the requirements of life was accomplished, meaning they took the Torah and kind of molded it to as fit their lives, rather than adjusting our life to fit the Torah. But he says, but nowhere in the Torah is there the slightest suggestion that the cessation of Melacha is not in itself the realization of the essential nature of Sabbath. That this cessation should simply serve as a means. To say that we rest, that we cease Melacha on Shabbos in order to be able to pursue spiritual matters, in order to have more time for our family, in order to be able to recover, right? That's saying the cessation is just a means to an end and not an end in itself. It doesn't have meaning in itself. But he says there's nothing that suggests that. Everywhere, by cessation of Melacha, and in it is Sabbath kept. Wherever the Torah talks about how do you keep Shabbos? By not doing Melacha. That's how you do it. That's what Shabbos is, refraining from Melacha. Everywhere in the Torah, by doing Melacha, and in it is Sabbath desecrated. How does one desecrate Sabbath? By doing Melacha. Everywhere. That's always how it's described in the Torah. That's the linchpin. It's all dependent on Melacha. Equally so, he continues, the idea of Melacha in no wise, great translation, no wise necessarily entails the idea of strenuous physical labor. Nowhere do we see that the word Melacha means labor, hard work, etc. It occurs nearly 200 times in the scriptures, and in no single instance does the word itself indicate strenuous work, just as the slave work in Egypt is never called Melacha, right? We never find what they did in Egypt described as Melacha. But everywhere, the essential idea of the word Melacha seems to be, as indeed its etymological derivation from malach has told us, that should say malach, not malacha, has told us, and we'll discuss what he means in a moment, not the greater or lesser amount of bodily fatigue, nothing to do with how much effort and strain and fatigue is involved, but the intelligent carrying out of an intention. What is a melacha? He's saying a melacha, what the Torah prohibits, is the intentional carrying out of an intention, so that even if we knew nothing of the oral traditional explanation, of course, he's saying we have an oral tradition that relates the melachos, these prohibited acts to the Mishkan and teaches us what they are, what the 39 are, and we could see that they're in general constructive acts, and not necessarily strenuous. But even without that, he says, simply from the actual meaning of the word and from the 100-fold evidence of the way it is used in the Bible, we should say that you shall not perform any melacha means thou shalt not perform any constructive work. It's clear from the word and from context that it means constructive work. Thou shalt not carry out the intention on anything, make no thing the bearer of thy purpose, thy ideas. In general, thou shalt not produce, not construct, or nor construct, maybe. So that's what it is. It's the performance of constructive work, and then he says, it shall not carry out thy intention on anything. Now he's already getting into his etymological idea of the word melacha. And this is something he talks about in a number of places, but he elaborates on it the most in Bereshis, in Genesis chapter 2, where we first encounter the word melacha. And there it's not talking about the prohibition of melacha on Shabbos, but it's talking about God's completion of the world. And it says there, and that's the next source, it says, God completed on the seventh day melachto, his melacha. God completed his melacha. So the creation of the world is God's melacha, and it says he abstained on the seventh day from all his melacha that he did. And then it says he blessed the seventh day, for thereon he abstained from all his melacha. So God used melacha to create the world, and on the seventh day he abstained from melacha, and it's that which melacha that we are to abstain from as well. So what is the idea of melacha? What is the etymological idea? Rav Hirsch alluded to the relationship between the word malach, which is an angel usually, but really a messenger, an agent, and the word melacha. So this is what Rav Hirsch says in Bereshis chapter 2. Everything which God created is called his melacha, right? It says God complete on the seventh day his melacha. Melacha is not work looked on as labor or toil. Of course, God doesn't labor or toil to create the world, but melacha is work looked on as something done or accomplished. Working is a term which only looks on the labor, on the greater or lesser effort of an activity without consideration of the result or the product. Avoda is working. Working is the process, with no concern for whether there's a result or not. Melacha only considers the result, the product of the activity. You can't have melacha if you don't produce something, right? And this is true within the laws of Shabbos as well. If it's the completion of the act that is the transgression. If it's only an attempted act, for example, if let's say somebody puts something on the stove to cook on Shabbos, and they take it off before it cooks, so they have not transgressed the biblical prohibition of cooking because it never actually cooked. Now, maybe it's still rabbinically prohibited to do that. It's even biblically prohibited to put it there because assuming it ends up leading to the result. But it's only if the result is there that the biblical prohibition is transgressed. It's melacha is result oriented. But melacha is simply the feminine of malach, he says. Malach, again, we are familiar with the word malach as an angel, but it really means a messenger. What malach is personally, melacha is factually. Just as malach, a messenger, is the bearer and executor of the thought and intention of another, so melacha is a thing which has become the bearing executor of the thought and intention of a mind. So he says, what is a malach? What's an angel? An angel is an agent of God, a messenger of God. it's the bearer and executor of God's intention. A melacha is when we take the material world and form it to become and allow it to execute our intent, our thought. Every material, he says, to which a directing mind has given a form conforming to a definite purpose, by being given that form, becomes the melacha of that mind, its actual messenger. It serves as the bearer of the thought and intention of that mind. For example, willow twigs lie there. As such, they can be used for all sorts of purposes. I weave them into a basket. Now the twigs serve exclusively for the purpose I gave them by the form into which I made them. So that the twigs which I wove into the basket have become thereby my actual malach, my melacha. They become my agent, so to speak. The materials are carrying out my will to become what I want them to become. To become when I take the raw materials of the world and I construct them into something. So then I take a significant step in their ability to become something, because some of the melachot, like to plant, let's say, I didn't immediately make something constructive, but something constructive will come from that eventually. So he says that is melacha. Melacha is where I have an intent and I turn the materials of this world into to bear that intent, my intention, into something factual, something physical. And just to conclude, to go back to discussing it in the context of God and creating the world, he says all that exists is here called the melacha of God, right? Because it says that God completed melachto, his melacha. It is not only in itself, by its existence, the realization of a thought of God, but it goes on continuously being the bearer and realizer of the thought of God that had been implanted in it, and of which it is to be the realization. The amount of material and forces given to each and the form into which it is stamped makes everything into a melacha of God. Meaning all of existence is the realization of God's thought, the realization of God's intent, and therefore, in a certain sense, God's messenger in the world. And that's why it is called melacha. So that's the etymological root of the idea of melacha, being something that is was formed with purpose, with intent to be my messenger in the physical world. And we find this in the laws of Shabbos. Again, there's biblical laws, there's rabbinic laws, but on the biblical level, at least, for a melacha to be transgressed. So first of all, it has to be constructive, productive, and not destructive. It can't be kilkul, destructive. So if I tear something to shreds, then and I destroy it, that's not a transgression on a Torah level. If I tear something carefully to a specific size, so that may be a transgression. If I tear something with the intent to then sew it back together, and so my destruction is really constructive. I'm tearing it to be able to re-sew it so that it's better. So that's considered constructive. That's not destructive. That's constructive. So again, for a biblical melacha to be transgressed, it has to be constructive. It has to be intentional. It has to be that I intended for this result. If it happened without me intending to do it, that's not melacha. Melacha is where I intended for this thing to become what it is, and so it has to be intentional. Okay, and there's other little details that also tie into this, but that's the basic idea of a melacha is an intentional, productive, constructive act, and there are specific intentional, constructive acts that we the sages have taught us, and those are derived, like we've said in the past, from the building of the Mishkan, from the building of the tabernacle. Now, okay, now one idea that we, why, what is the message? Why are we prohibited from Melacha on Shabbos? So what we mentioned briefly last week from Rav Hirsch, and this is his main idea with regards to Melacha on Shabbos, is that God has given us this world to be the masters over it, to use it for our purposes, but ultimately for his purposes. The reason that God puts us here is to take the material world and use it in his service. The ultimate expression of that is the building of the Mishkan, is the building of the tabernacle and the temples, and really that's the ideal almost of taking all of our skills, all of our talents, and all of the physical materials that exist and using them for a godly purpose, and using them to create this abode for God in this world, which is supposed to teach us and remind us that all our acts should be for that intent, to serve God. But every week we need a reminder of this. Every seventh day, every Shabbos, God says, I need to remind you that which I've made you a master over the physical world is only so that you can use it for me. And so every seventh day, we're reminded that we're not really the masters over it, because God says, I'm really the master over it. Because I'm going to tell you to take a break. I'm going to tell you to stop, to cease from all these constructive activities, all these acts that demonstrate mastery of the world, that demonstrate our ability to take the world and construct something out of it, to make something, to change it in a constructive way. Though that's how we demonstrate our mastery of the world. But once a week, God says, pause, put a pause on that, and remind yourself that it's really all for me. It's all for me. And the way we're reminded of that is when God says, stop. If you look at the next source, so we're on page 2 in the middle. So this is in Shemos chapter 35. So Rav Hirsch says, if we look into all these categories, they all have the common quality of being actual constructive or productive activities. So he actually had just listed off the 39 melachos, the 39 prohibited acts, constructive activities. Just to briefly list some of them, or all of them: sowing, plowing, cutting, gathering, threshing, winnowing, separating, grinding, sieving, kneading, baking, shearing, washing, bleaching, combing, dyeing, coloring, spinning. Some of these are just different ways of saying the same thing: chain making, loop making, weaving, splitting threads, knotting, undoing such knots, sewing, tearing in order to sew more, hunting, killing, flaying, tanning, salting, drawing lines, smoothing, cutting, writing, rubbing, erasing, meaning building, demolishing, to build more, kindling fire, extinguishing fire, and finishing off something, and finally carrying from one domain to another. So Rav Hirsch says that if we look into all these categories, or almost all of them, they have the common quality of being actual constructive or productive activities, such by which the object becomes changed and by the intentional work accomplished. Man's power and mastery over matter is demonstrated. We make a change in something, we demonstrate our mastery over the world by initiating a change in it. Hence, refraining from exercising this power on Sabbath is a befitting manner of showing man's allegiance to the one only true master and creator. To a man in his mastery over matter and apparently creative powers is only a leaseholder, a servant. All those creative powers, we are just leaseholders. We are servants of God, and by pausing, that's what demonstrates that. Even the gathering together and heaping up. So now he's really asking a question. He's saying, 1 second. Some of these do not involve any change in the item itself. So, for example, gathering together, like different crops, let's say. So the gathering together and heaping up of the products of the soil. Or if you trap an animal and it's inside the trap, but it's not changed at all, it's just in a box now. So you haven't done any physical change. How does that demonstrate your mastery? He says, even the gathering together and heaping up of the product of the soil and the catching of a wild animal or fish, although the fruit or the animal is not changed in itself, brings about such an essential change in bringing it out of the free state of nature into the control and power of human possession. That these X2 fall under the same basic idea as the others. So maybe I'm not making a physical change, but the change is substantial in that it previously was in nature and outside of my possession, and now I'm bringing it into human possession. I'm demonstrating my mastery. Trapping an animal is demonstrating my mastery over it, and even if I haven't actually altered the animal, I could set it free. It will be the same as it was before, but it still is a way of demonstrating my mastering. It's that I submit to God on Shabbos. But the one thing that stands out that still needs to be explained is the final Melacha, what's listed as the last of the 39 Melachos, and that is carrying. That is bringing something from one domain to another. So the Torah prohibits us from carrying something from a public domain into a private domain, from a private domain into a public domain, and it also prohibits us from carrying something 4 cubits, 4 amos, 6 feet or so, in the public domain. So picking something up and moving it 4 amos, 4 cubits in the public domain. Now this doesn't seem to demonstrate my mastery over the world. No change occurs within the object. Some will say, well, the change that occurs is it changes location. That may be true, but where do I see a change in the object that it's considered a Melacha? It's considered a Melacha. Nothing actually changes. The truth is, the sages already were concerned to bother by this. They call it a Melacha Gerua, like a weaker Melacha. There's something lesser about it, which may lead to some small leniencies, but that's the general principle. Now, in practice, this specific Melacha is the rabbinic law that exists on top of the biblical law, because it's so easy, I guess, to transgress. So there's a lot of rabbinic law built on top of the biblical law. So what would be considered a public domain by Torah law, the rabbis expanded to many other types of domains, which are kind of semi-public, semi-private, to include those domains. That's where we really get the concept of an Eruv, which allows one to carry in one of those domains. An Eruv will never allow one to carry in a real public domain. A real public domain, again, it has to be like, where many, many people travel and meet other certain specific guidelines. A real public domain, an Eruv is not going to help to allow one to carry. Where the Eruv comes in is in those semi-public domains, which the rabbis prohibited carrying in or from a private domain to. There, the rabbis also said, but if you do an Eruv, so then you're allowed to carry. And how an Eruv works exactly is topic for another time, but that's just a little bit of the background. But we still have our question. What is the story with carrying? How does this fit into the general concept, the general categorization of all these melachos as some kind of constructive change of something that demonstrates my mastery over it? How does this fit in? So Rav Hirsch has a very novel approach to this whole question and basically carves out an entirely new category of Melacha that this prohibition falls under, the prohibition of carrying. And he points us first to some verses at the end of the book of Nehemiah, where this prohibition seems to have been slightly abused in Israel as they were rebuilding and after the building of the second temple, and those are not the verses that I put on the page. We'll get to those verses in a moment. In Nehemiah, Nehemiah says, he says, in those days I saw in Judea people treading wine presses on the Sabbath. So that's may involve a couple of prohibitions to squeeze the grapes on Shabbos. And then loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, and figs, and all types of loads, and bring them to Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day. So they were selling them, and they were full desecration of Shabbos and carrying them as well. And he said, Nehemiah says that, what is this that I quarreled with them, and I said, what is this bad thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your ancestors do this? And our God brought upon us all this calamity upon the city, and you are increasing the wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath, etc. So already there we have that there's people violating this, and Nehemiah is very concerned. He says this is what caused the profaning the Sabbath is what caused the destruction of the first temple. Is really what he seems to be saying. Now, if we go to the verses I put on the source sheet, a series of verses in Yirmiyah and Jeremiah. So, so this is what the prophet Yirmiyah had to say during the time of the first temple. And he says, so said the Lord to me, go and stand in the gate of the children of the people in which the kings of Judah come, and out of which they go, and in all the gates of Jerusalem. And you shall say to them, hearken to the word of the Lord, O kings of Judah, and all of Judah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem who come into these gates. So said the Lord, beware for your souls, and carry no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring into the gates of Jerusalem. He says, beware for your souls, do not carry, do not transgress the prohibition of carrying on Shabbos. Neither shall you take a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day, nor shall you perform any labor. Melacha, right? And you shall hallow the Sabbath day as I commanded your forefathers. But they did not hearken, neither did they bend their ears, and they hardened their nape, not to hearken and not to receive instruction. And it shall be, if you hearken to me, says the Lord, not to bring any burden into the gates of the city on the Sabbath day, and to hallow the Sabbath day, not to perform any labor thereon. Then shall there enter into the gates of the city kings and princes sitting on David's throne, riding in chariots and with horses, they and the princes, the men of Judah, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And this city shall be inhabited forever. And they shall come from the cities of Judah and from the environs of Jerusalem and from the land of Benjamin, etc. They'll bring offerings. And verse 27, if you will not hearken to me to hallow the Sabbath day and not to carry burdens and to come into the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath, I will kindle a fire in her gates and I will consume the palaces of Jerusalem and it will not be quenched. So God warns through his prophet Yirmiyah, Jeremiah, that the city of Jerusalem is dependent on the observance of Shabbos. If you guard the Shabbos, it will stand forever, and if not, then it will be destroyed. But if you notice, there's two things he warns over and over again: don't do melacha, and don't carry. Don't carry and don't do melacha, over and over again, as if there's the carrying, which up till now, we may have always thought was just another one of the 39 melachos. It sounds like it's its own category. It's not one of the melachos, or it's a different kind of melacha. So Rav Hirsch says, based on this, that we see that carrying does not seem to be integral, a part of the general prohibition of melachos. It seems to be its own category. So let's see how he explains it. And this is on the last page, page 3. He says, but carrying is an affair purely of the social world. The whole idea of social life, of living not isolated, but in a community, in a state, cannot be represented more fully than by the relation of the individual to the community to the individual, meaning what the individual has to give to the community and what the community gives and does for the individual. What the individual takes out of his own private possession and pays to the state, meaning to the community, and what he gets back for himself. And finally, the furthering of public purposes and needs in the public domain. So he says there's 3 parts to community. There's what an individual gives to the community. There's what the community gives to each individual. And then there's the furthering of public needs within the public space. This is most clearly expressed by carrying from the public domain to the private, from the private domain to the public, and 4 cubits in the public domain. The Torah says I cannot carry from my domain into the public domain, symbolizing that the relationship, the mastery that I may have in the social world, in the community, in the state of what I contribute to the community, on Shabbos, I give that over to God. What the community gives to me is represented by me carrying from the public domain to the private domain. On Shabbos, I give that over to God. And within the public domain itself, what the needs of the public are attended to, public purposes, we cannot carry 4 amos, 4 cubits in the public domain. And he says, if accordingly the prohibition of all the other melachos expresses the idea that man subordinates the use of his powers over matter to the will of God, that's how we explain the other melachos. The prohibition of carrying may well express the idea of man placing his social life too under the dictates of the laws of God. The former is the acknowledgement of God in nature, the other melachos. The latter in history and human affairs. The one places man's work in nature and on matter under the rule of God. The other, his work in the state, in the community, under the same rule. And as certain as it is that the conception of our world comprises both nature and state, so certain is it that God's mastery of the world includes both nature and history. The establishment of the kingdom of God on earth to be built up by recognition of the Sabbath will only then be complete and real when man acknowledges and keeps the laws of God and making the rules for his own working life in connection with nature and matter, and also his national life of the state. In other words, what Rav Hirsch is saying is that we don't only submit and give over and acknowledge God's mastery over nature on Shabbos and say, yes, God, you've given me the ability to construct and be productive with the materials of the world, but I am reminding on Shabbos what I'm told to see is that that's all belongs to you. But you've also created a state and a community and a social life. And that too I need to give over to God. That also, I think that during the week I'm in control and I'm the master over it, but it all has to be in the context of service of God. And Shabbos has to remind me of that too. And the way I'm reminded of that on Shabbos is through the prohibition of carrying. Prohibition of carrying is all about the relationship of a person and a community and the community itself, represented by not carrying from myself out to the community, out to the public domain, not bringing from the public domain into my own space, and not carrying within the public domain. That's supposed to capture the idea of community, of the state, of the social fabric, that I also acknowledge that it's all for the service of God. God should be master over it. And so I refrain and hold back on Shabbos. And just to conclude, Rav Hirsch says that these 2 ideas are also captured by the 2 ideas of Shabbos commemorating the creation of the world and Shabbos commemorating the Exodus from Egypt. In the creation of the world, that's nature. That's God's that's God's mastery over the universe, and we rest and acknowledge that God created everything. It's all His. It's all for the purpose of serving Him. the Exodus, Yitzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, was our becoming a nation, our becoming a state. And the prohibitions of carrying are to remind us that that too, as a nation, as a community, is also to be devoted towards towards God. It's all for the purpose of serving God. All that we do within a community, what we contribute, what we get back, what we build, the institutions that we make, all are for this purpose, are all for the purpose of serving God. So that's the Rav Hirsch's view on Melacha. It's an essential part of Shabbos. It's an ending itself, meaning there's a message. It's not just that I'm resting for the purpose of being available now to do other things. The resting itself is a submission. I stop doing these things. It's a submission of my control over these affairs in my life and in the world, submitting that to God. A weekly reminder that it's all for Him. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.